The dock was still wet from the night before. Reeve Callister stood at the far end of it, heels too close to the edge, wool dress catching the wind off Lake Willoughby. She hadn't slept. Her bag sat on the planks like something left at a bus stop, too expensive, too out of place, too much a reminder of the life she'd driven north to stop thinking about. Third morning, before 6, she heard him, before she saw him, boots on the path, a truck door closing without force. He came around the tree line with a canvas toolbox and didn't slow when he saw her. He crouched at the dock's near end, examined the rotted plank, and began to work. No good morning, no apology. Neither of them said a word. The lake was flat and gray and enormous. She finally spoke, not because she had decided to, but because the silence had become something that almost felt comfortable and that frightened her. "You're not curious what I'm doing out here at 6. 0 inches the morning?" He didn't stop working, didn't look up. Then he said one quiet sentence, and Reeve Callister went completely still. Not because it was profound, because it was true in a way no one had managed in a very long time. She didn't know his name or why those words settled in her chest the way they did. By the time she thought to respond, he'd gone back to work. She had been carrying it for 3 years without knowing exactly what it weighed. Bryce Landon had entered her life the way certain men do, with total confidence in the impression he was making. She met him at a dinner her father hosted for prospective investment partners in the spring of 2016, the year she turned 26. She had just come back from London, 2 years at the LSE behind her, and the slow work of learning her father's company from the inside still ahead of her. Bryce was 35, polished in the particular way of men who had worked very hard to appear effortless, and he had a story she didn't yet know was borrowed. He told anyone who would listen that he had designed Callister Tower, a landmark mixed-use development along the Boston waterfront, built by the Boston Harbor Civic Trust. It was a credible story. The building was beautiful. The recognition that followed it was real. What nobody at that table knew was that the design had come from someone else entirely. She hadn't known either. She'd been in London when the building was completed, had only ever seen the photographs, had never thought to examine a construction filing from 2014. The marriage had been a slow erosion. Bryce was not a cruel man in any theatrical sense. He did not raise his voice. He did not belittle her. What he did, and she only understood it fully in retrospect, the way you understand a tide only after it has already taken something, was position himself closer and closer to the center of things she was supposed to control. He joined the advisory board of Callister Group. He made introductions. In the summer of 2022, he brokered a deal no one else had managed to close, the acquisition of Meridian Properties, a $340 million transaction that added 6 buildings to the Callister portfolio overnight. His brokerage fee was $4.2 million. 6 months later, he asked her to sign an addendum to their prenuptial agreement, acknowledging that the fee constituted a direct economic contribution to the company. She had signed it. She had trusted him. When she discovered 2 years later, reviewing contracts ahead of a board restructuring, that the addendum had been drafted not by their shared attorney, but by a paralegal at Bryce's firm, she understood the shape of everything at once. He had been building a legal claim quietly, the way someone builds a wall one brick at a time while you stand nearby, assuming it is something else. She filed for divorce 4 days after finding the clause. Bryce filed a counterclaim 8 days after that, seeking recognition of 18% of Callister Group's outstanding shares as marital property. The first hearing was 6 weeks away. She had driven to Vermont not to hide, but to find enough stillness to think clearly before the fight began. She needed 1 week of not being the person everyone needed something from. She stood on the dock again that evening, after he had gone. The plank had been replaced, straight, solid, sanded, smooth at the edges. She sat down on the new wood, and for the first time in 3 days her lungs felt the right size for her body. She thought about what he had said. He had answered her question with something so spare and so accurate, it had stopped her completely. People usually ask if you're doing okay when what they want to hear is that you are. She was standing at the end of a dock before sunrise. He figured she didn't need anyone asking. No sympathy, no analysis. Just a man who looked at a situation and said what was true about it. She didn't know his name, but she came back to the dock the following morning, just the same. She found out the next day. Greta Osmond ran Maple and Main, a coffee shop in the center of Ashford that looked like it had been built in stages over 40 years and had stopped apologizing for that somewhere around the 3rd stage. The countertops were mismatched. The chairs were mismatched. The coffee was exceptional. Reeve walked in because she didn't want to cook and stayed because Greta did not ask her a single question about herself for the first 20 minutes. They talked about the weather, about the dock, about the property owner, who Greta described as a man who fixed nothing himself but had the good sense to hire someone who did. Malcolm Bennett, she said, refilling Reeve's cup without being asked. He's been doing work around the lake for about 4 years now. Doesn't say much. Never has to do anything twice. Reeve asked a few careful questions. Greta told her what she knew. Widower, a young son, moved to Ashford from Burlington. That was the circumference of what Greta offered, and Reeve understood without being told that it was also the circumference of what Malcolm allowed anyone to know. She ran into him that same afternoon at the hardware store on Route 5. She needed a fuse for the kitchen circuit box. He was there for lumber screws and sandpaper. They reached the checkout at the same time, and he nodded the way you nod at someone you recognize from a specific context and don't expect to see outside of it. She asked how long he'd been doing this kind of work. He said 4 years. She asked what he'd done before that, and he said, without hesitation and without any desire to continue the subject, something else. She left it there. She was not a person who left things there, not in business, not in conversation, but something in the way he said it, not defensive, not evasive, simply complete, made pressing feel like the wrong instrument for this moment. Then his coat pocket caught the edge of the checkout counter as he turned to leave, and a small sketchbook fell to the floor between them. She picked it up, he reached for it, and she handed it back. But in the 2 seconds the book was open in her hand, she saw enough clean orthographic lines, sectional elevations with scale notation in the margins, structural load arrows penciled in faint and precise along a beam run. The handwriting in the corner was architectural shorthand, so habitual it had become unconscious. This was not the sketchbook of a hobbyist or a self-taught craftsman. This was the work of someone trained at a serious level over many years. Someone who had spent thousands of hours learning to read buildings from the inside out as systems of force and material and light. He tucked the book into his other pocket, said nothing. She said nothing either. He thanked her and walked out. She sat in her car in the parking lot, a long moment. 4 years of carpentry work around a Vermont lake. Something else before that? A sketchbook full of structural drawings carried in a coat pocket like a private language he had no intention of translating for anyone. The question she couldn't quite form followed her all the way back to the water. 3 days into her stay, a shelf bracket in the rental's living room gave way. It was a minor thing. She could have wedged a book under the sagging end, and no one would have noticed until she left. Instead, she called the property owner, mentioned the bracket, and asked if Malcolm Bennett was the right person to contact. She knew exactly what she was doing. She called anyway. He came the following afternoon. The bracket took 12 minutes. He had brought the correct screw gauge without being told the hardware size, which meant he had looked carefully the last time he was in the house and had filed away what might eventually need attention. It was the kind of small, unannounced competence that most people never notice because they are not watching for it. Isaiah arrived while Malcolm was washing his hands at the kitchen sink. The school bus dropped him at the end of the road, and he walked the quarter-mile to wherever his father was working, a habit so established it needed no announcement. He pushed the front door open, looked at Reeve standing by the counter, and turned to his father with the directness of a child who has decided most situations are manageable if you simply ask about them. "Is she your friend?" Malcolm dried his hands. "She's a client." Isaiah considered this, found it satisfactory, retrieved a granola bar from his backpack, and went outside to sit on the porch steps. He was 7 years old, with warm brown skin and a soft cloud of tight curls, and he moved through the world with the uncluttered practicality of a child who had learned early that adults had their own concerns, and that a granola bar was a reliable constant. Reeve watched him go and thought that he had his father's economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing performed for an audience. Malcolm had deep brown skin, close-cropped coils, and the steady physical presence of a black man who had learned long ago not to waste words where competence would do. Reeve had already set 2 mugs on the table. She didn't ask. Malcolm looked at them for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat down. She told him a partial truth more than she had told anyone else that week. She said she'd finalized a divorce, that it hadn't involved anything dramatic, that what made it hard was not the ending itself, but the recognition of what she should have seen earlier and hadn't. She said, "I spent 3 years not noticing I was losing ground I believed was mine." He didn't reach across the table with something reassuring. He didn't offer a framework or a parallel story. He sat with what she'd said the way someone actually sits with information. They are genuinely considering, present, unhurried. And then he spoke quietly, his eyes on something past the window. "Some people are very good at making control look like care," he said. "By the time you recognize the difference, you've already given them access to something they didn't earn." It landed not as comfort, but as recognition, the kind of sentence that only comes from someone who paid for it the same way she was paying now. She didn't ask what he meant. She understood he was not speaking theoretically. And she understood, too, that asking would be taking something he hadn't offered. Outside, Isaiah had found a long stick and was conducting a purposeful project in the yard, the nature of which was known only to himself. On the 5th morning, she came to Maple and Main before the breakfast rush. Greta set a cup down without being asked, and settled into the easy quiet of a woman who had stood behind a counter long enough to know the difference between a customer who wanted to be left alone and one who simply wanted to be near another person without needing to explain. Why? Greta told her about Tiana. Tiana Bennett had died in January of 2020 on Interstate 91 heading north in a snowstorm on her way home from a late shift. Isaiah had been 2 years old. Malcolm had sold the Burlington house within 3 months and arrived in Ashford with a truck, a boy, and very little else. "I don't know if he was running from something or starting over," Greta said. "Maybe he didn't know either. He doesn't talk about it and I stopped asking." Reeve walked the trail along the eastern edge of the lake that afternoon, the one that curved through birch trees and came out behind the properties on the north shore. She heard footsteps behind her about halfway through and turned to find Malcolm coming up the trail at an easy pace, a canvas work bag over one shoulder. He was finishing a job at a property farther down the shore and cut through most afternoons on his way back to his truck, he said. Nothing arranged. They walked together without deciding to. For a stretch, neither spoke, which by now felt less unusual than it might have a week earlier. He asked. At some point, when she had started working at Callister Group. She told him, back from London, in 2015, into the company early the following year, taking on real authority by 2019, when her father began stepping back. She said it plainly, the way you describe the shape of your life to someone who asked in good faith. He was quiet a moment. Then, your father built it from the ground up. He did, started with 2 buildings in the South End, 30 years to get to where it is now. He nodded, the way he nodded when he was actually thinking about something, rather than simply acknowledging he had heard it. She asked then where he had studied. She kept her voice even, as though it were a natural follow-on question. It was, but she was also watching for what would happen when she asked it. What happened was this. He didn't deflect, and he didn't look away. He said, Harvard, the Graduate School of Design. I finished in 2010. He said it the way someone states a fact that still belongs to them, even if they have stopped using it, not with pride, not with bitterness, just with the steadiness of a person who has made a particular peace with their own history and does not need anyone else to make sense of it for them. A Harvard-trained architect, 4 years into a carpentry operation in rural Vermont, carrying a sketchbook in his coat pocket and declining to explain himself to anyone who hadn't asked the right way. A black man in spaces that had probably asked him to prove himself twice and then taken what he built anyway. The trail opened onto a clearing above the north shore. The lake lay below them in the late afternoon light, silver and still. They stood there a moment before turning back. That evening she called her attorney from the rental kitchen and told him she needed a private investigation firm, not a paralegal, not a junior associate to examine the full professional history of Land and Design Associates from 2010 through 2016. Every major project, every contract on record, every bid submission that could be found, her attorney asked what she was looking for. She said she wasn't certain yet, but she knew the kind of man Bryce was, and she believed that a man who does something once and finds it effective does not stop at once. The investigator said 5 to 7 days. A light was burning in Malcolm's workshop down the road when she finally turned off the kitchen lamp. She noticed it through the window, warm and yellow against the dark tree line, and stood there a moment longer than she needed to before going to bed. On the evening of the 6th day, her phone rang. She was at the kitchen counter when her attorney called with the investigator's findings. She opened her laptop and read the report standing up, her tea going cold beside her. The original design contract for Callister Tower had been awarded to Malcolm Bennett Architect in the fall of 2013 by the Boston Harbor Civic Trust. The contract was on record with the city, his signature, his professional license number, his firm's Burlington address. The work was his, entirely and documentably his. In November of 2014, a contract amendment had been filed transferring design credit and all associated rights to Land & Design Associates. The amendment bore a signature attributed to Malcolm Bennett, but the investigator had flagged it. The signature was inconsistent with 6 authenticated samples from Malcolm's other documents in the same period. The discrepancy was significant enough to warrant forensic examination. The Trust's internal director at the time, a man named Colton Walsh, later forced out for separate reasons, had processed the amendment and buried the original filing beneath revision layers designed to make it difficult to surface without knowing exactly what you were looking for. Reeve closed the laptop. She sat down at the kitchen table, which she almost never did without a purpose. She sat there and did not move for a while. The dark had settled completely over the lake. Through the window, the only light visible through the pines was the yellow glow of the workshop down the road. She thought about the sketchbook falling from his coat pocket at the checkout counter, the 2 seconds it had been open in her hand. She thought about the orthographic lines and the scale notations and the load arrows penciled along the beam run, the handwriting of someone trained to think in structures. She thought about the way he had said something else when she asked what he had done before, said it so completely and without apology that she had not pressed, even though pressing was her nature. She thought about his dark brown hands on the dock that first morning, the unhurried confidence of someone who has been doing precise physical work long enough that the body carries the knowledge without being reminded. She had been watching him for nearly a week and had understood piece by piece that there was a very large distance between where this man had started and where he had ended up, and that the distance had not been covered by choice. Now she knew what had covered it. She thought about a 8-year-old architect 5 years out of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, who had spent 11 months designing a building along the Boston waterfront that would go up with someone else's name on it, who had fought it and lost, who had moved to a small town in Vermont and learned a different trade and had been there 4 years carrying all of it, telling no one. She thought about what it cost to carry something like that without putting it down, and what it must have been like to be asked about it tonight by a woman he had known for 8 days in a workshop in the dark and answer plainly. She put on her coat. She picked up her keys out of habit, then set them back down. The workshop was a 5-minute walk. She went on foot. The door was open a few inches against the cold. She pushed it the rest of the way and stood in the frame. Malcolm was at his work table running a palm sander along the face of a wide oak board, slow and even. He switched the sander off when she appeared and set it down without hurrying. "Something else needs fixing," he said. "I need to ask you about Callister Tower." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. He looked at her steadily, careful, not unkind, not pretending he didn't understand what she was asking. "You've been looking into me," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of what was true. She told him about the investigation, that she had asked her attorneys to examine Bryce's professional history going back to 2010, looking for anything that might challenge the basis of his legal claim. The investigator had found the original contract, found the amendment, found the problem with the signature. He sat down on the wooden stool beside his work table. It was the first time she had seen him sit suddenly, without ease or forethought, the body doing what it must when the ground shifts. He told her what had happened. He told it plainly, the way you describe something you have turned over so many times it no longer has rough edges. In 2013, he had been commissioned to design a mixed-use development for the Boston Harbor Civic Trust. He was 28, 5 years out of graduate school, and it was the project he had been working towards since his first year of training. He had spent 11 months on the design. Bryce Landon had been the project manager, representing the Trust's financial partners with access to every drawing, every model file, every revision. When the project moved toward construction, Bryce had approached the Trust's internal director, Colton Walsh, and arranged the amendment. Malcolm had never agreed to transfer anything. The signature was not his. He had fought it, hired an attorney, filed a complaint with the Massachusetts Board of Architects. The board had found the dispute unresolved due to contradictory documentation and taken no action. Without money for prolonged litigation, and without a path to proving the forgery through conventional means, he had eventually stopped fighting. Then Bryce had done something worse. Using his network in the development community, he had spread a quiet account of a young Burlington architect who had failed to honor a major commitment. Nothing written, nothing that could be contested, just information moving through an industry the way water moves through soil, leaving a residue no one can point to. Within 2 years, Malcolm couldn't get a meeting. Tiana picked up extra shifts, he said. Night shifts, mostly. She never complained. She never made me feel like I'd done something wrong. He looked at the half-finished board on the table. She was driving home from a double shift the night her car went off the road. Reeve didn't tell him he shouldn't blame himself. She had enough respect for him not to offer the obvious thing. She asked instead, "Did she know how much you loved the work?" He was quiet a moment. She knew. That's why she never once asked me to give it up. They stayed with that. The door was still open behind her and the cold came in steadily. And neither of them moved to close it. She told him what she intended to do. The Meridian brokerage deal, Bryce's entire legal claim against her, had been secured in part because Bryce had represented himself to Meridian's board as the architect of Callister Tower. Internal Meridian emails confirmed it. If the tower design was fraudulent, the credential was fraudulent. And if the credential was fraudulent, the foundation of the brokerage contract was built on misrepresentation. She needed him to formally confirm his authorship as a party with legal standing. She could not do it without him. Then she said the other thing, the part she hadn't planned, said anyway because she was tired of calculating everything before she let it leave her mouth. "I know you've spent 11 years not looking back at any of this," she said. "If you don't want to be part of it, I understand that completely." She meant it. The completeness with which she meant it surprised even her. He didn't answer that night. He said he needed time. And she nodded and walked back up the road. She told herself what kept her awake was the hearing, the legal strategy, the weeks of accumulated pressure. She was not entirely convincing. Malcolm drove to the lake after Isaiah was asleep at Greta's. He parked above the dock and walked down to the end of the repaired plank, the one he had replaced 9 days earlier, before he knew her name, before any of this. He sat at the edge and looked at the water. He did not think about Bryce. He had cycled through that enough in the years just after the anger, the exhaustion, the specific grief of watching something you built get attributed to someone who hadn't earned it. He had stopped eventually, not because he had forgiven anything, but because continuing cost more than he could afford and gave him nothing back. He thought about Tiana. He thought about the call at 2, 17 inches the morning, January of 2020, and about the fact that she had been on that road because of him, because the work he could no longer do had made her work harder, drive later, come home through the dark, on a night when the plows hadn't come through yet. He had carried that for 5 years. It had not gotten lighter. It had only become more familiar, the way a scar becomes familiar, not gone, simply part of the landscape. He thought about what it would mean to go back. Not to the career, he was clear enough about that, but to the record. To have his name placed back where it had been taken from, to acknowledge in front of a court and an investigator and whoever else needed to witness it, that the design was his, and that what had been done to him had a name. He had spent 11 years not doing that. He had spent 11 years deciding over and over that the cost of reopening it was higher than the cost of carrying it. The difference now was that someone else had found the door. He thought about Reeve standing in the frame of his workshop, not pushing, not calculating, saying, "I understand that completely," and meaning every word of it. He had spent a decade learning to read the difference between people who said things because they expected a particular response and people who said things because they were true. She had been the latter from the first morning on the dock, when she had stood at the far end and he had said the only honest thing available, and she had gone completely still, the way people go still when they hear something that fits. He thought about Isaiah, asleep at a neighbor's house, who had drawn a logo for a business that didn't fully exist yet, with the unself-conscious confidence of someone for whom the future was simply the next thing that was going to happen. He drove back to the house. He slept. At 8 the next morning, he knocked on her door. She opened it in a sweater and reading glasses, a mug in her hand, documents spread across the kitchen table. He had stopped at Maple and Main on the way and brought a cup from Greta, who had handed it over without comment. He held it out. She took it. "I'll sign," he said. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to manage. She stepped back and held the door open, and he came inside. He drove to Boston 3 days later to meet with the Callister Group's legal team. Isaiah stayed with Greta. It was the first time Malcolm had left Ashford since moving there 4 years before, and he noticed that fact on the highway heading south quietly. The way you notice something significant when it arrives as plain information rather than as feeling. The meeting took 3 hours. He signed the documents confirming his authorship of the tower design and authorizing the forensic examination of the contract amendment. The attorneys were efficient and professionally courteous, extending the specific courtesy you extend to someone whose cooperation you need, and whose goodwill you are therefore careful to preserve. He understood the dynamic and didn't mind it. This was a transaction with a clear purpose. It was also the right thing. Those two facts could coexist without either canceling the other. Reeve had ordered food from a place near her apartment, pizza in flat cardboard boxes on the kitchen counter. Nothing set for anything, nothing performed. He hadn't eaten since morning. Neither had she. They stood at the counter and ate without ceremony, and then moved to the table and talked. Not about the case, not about Bryce or the legal machinery now set in motion. They talked the way people talk when they have spent 2 weeks carefully circling something and have finally run out of reasons to keep circling, directly without managing the impression they were making. He told her about the tower design, the early sketches, the 3 structural models, the decision to let the ground floor open entirely to the harbor rather than enclose it for commercial tenancy. He had chosen open, and 11 years later he still believed it had been right, even though the decision carried different weight now than it once had. He talked about it with a precision and a quiet pleasure that he hadn't felt in his own voice in a long time, and he was aware of that as it was happening, aware that something was loosening that had been held in place by sustained effort for too many years. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, with questions that showed she had actually heard what he said. She told him about London, the 2 years that were supposed to form her, and had mostly made her homesick in a way she hadn't admitted to anyone until now. She told him about coming back and finding her father further along and stepping away than she had expected, about learning to run a company by running it, making mistakes she couldn't afford twice, and carrying the education of those mistakes quietly because there was no other way to carry them. He said at one point, "Tiana knew how much I loved the work. That's why she never once asked me to give it up, even when it would have made everything easier." Reeve looked at him. "Is that the part that's hardest? That she protected something for you all the way to the end?" He held the question for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that's the part." The rain had started outside without either of them noticing when it began. It ran down the kitchen window in slow lines, blurring the city lights into something softer and less demanding. She put her hand on the table beside his, not reaching across it, just placing it there, close enough that their fingers were nearly touching. He turned his hand over slowly, and her fingers settled against his palm. They stayed like that without speaking, and the city went on outside in the rain, and neither of them was in any hurry to be anywhere else. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in November, at the Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston. Bryce arrived with 4 attorneys. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man whose arithmetic had come out in his favor. His team had spent 6 weeks constructing their argument around the Meridian brokerage contract, $4.2 million in fees representing sustained independent economic contribution to Callister Group, sufficient to override the prenuptial restriction on company shares. It was a solid argument built on documentation he believed was unassailable. Reeve's lead attorney presented in 2 stages, without theater. The first was the Meridian contract itself, not the number but the mechanism. He entered into evidence a series of internal Meridian Properties emails from the due diligence period of 2022, in which Meridian's investment committee had debated whether to engage Bryce Landon as broker for the Callister acquisition. The deciding factor, documented in the committee minutes, was a single line: agreed to proceed with Landon based on his tower credentials and the confidence those engagements represent. Bryce had represented himself to Meridian as the architect of Callister Tower. That representation had opened the door. The second stage was the tower itself. The forensic analysis of the November 2014 contract amendment was complete. The signature attributed to Malcolm Bennett had been examined against 6 authenticated samples from the same period. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the amendment was not his. The amendment had been executed without his knowledge or consent. The original design contract, duly executed in 2013, remained in effect and remained his. Landon Design Associates had no legal basis for the credit transfer that had formed the cornerstone of Bryce Landon's professional identity in commercial real estate. The implication, laid out without drama, was precise. The credential Bryce had used to open the Meridian negotiation was fraudulent. The brokerage contract had been obtained through misrepresentation, The $4.2 million, the centerpiece of his argument that he had made an independent economic contribution to Callister Group, rested on a foundation that was not his to stand on. Bryce's team objected. Bryce himself, in a moment his attorneys would later describe in the careful language of legal postmortems as unhelpful, interjected from the table to accuse Reeve of fabricating evidence. The judge, 16 years on the family law bench, not easily surprised, asked Bryce's team to explain why internal emails from a third-party corporation with no interest in the divorce proceeding would constitute fabricated evidence. The table fell quiet. The judge did not rule on the merits that day. She ordered an independent review of the Meridian brokerage relationship and its connection to the tower credentials to be completed within 90 days. Bryce's claim on the 18% share position was suspended pending that review. Malcolm had not been inside the courtroom. He waited in the corridor on the third floor, in a wooden chair against the wall, his coat across his knees. When Reeve came through the double doors, she walked toward him and he stood. "Well," he said. "Not over," she said. "But he doesn't have the ground anymore." He nodded once. She stopped in front of him and looked at him, and she said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the morning she stood on a dock and heard a stranger say the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. "You asked me back at the dock if I needed anyone asking how I was doing," she said. "The answer right now is not entirely, but I'm getting there." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him, and it was enough. They walked out into the November cold together, and the city was gray and busy and entirely indifferent to the two of them, and that suited both of them fine. 4 months later, the independent review concluded. The forensic finding on the 2014 signature held Bryce Landon's claim on the 18% share position was rejected in its entirety. The prenuptial agreement stood as written. The matter of the fraudulent amendment was referred to the Suffolk County Civil Division for separate proceedings. Within 6 weeks of the story appearing in the Boston Globe, 14 measured paragraphs in the business section, nothing sensational, the facts sufficient on their own, Landon Capital lost 3 of its largest institutional partners. The reputation Bryce had built over 11 years on a borrowed foundation came apart the way such things come apart, not all at once, but piece by piece, until what remained was too small to be called by the same name. Callister Group, at Reeve's direction and with Warren Callister's agreement, formally restored Malcolm Bennett's authorship credit on all archival documentation associated with the tower project. The correction was filed with the Boston Harbor Civic Trust, with the city's building records office, and with the American Institute of Architects. A financial settlement was reached outside of court. Malcolm did not return to commercial architecture. He used his portion of the settlement to expand the workshop and register the business, Bennett & Co. Residential Design and Custom Woodwork, Ashford, Vermont. The logo had been drawn by Isaiah on a Tuesday afternoon in crayon, a small house with a tall tree beside it and a sun in the upper left corner, rendered with the confident asymmetry of a 7-year-old who has decided what something looks like and sees no reason to reconsider. Malcolm had it transferred to cardstock at a printer in Burlington, framed it in white oak, and hung it beside the workshop door. The first 3 clients came through Greta. By January, there was a waiting list. Reeve did not give up the lakeside rental. She had signed a 6-month extension in October before the hearing, without explaining her reasons to anyone. She continued to run Callister Group from Boston. It was hers, and her father had built it to last, and she intended to run it accordingly. But on Friday evening, she drove north on Interstate 91 through the mountains and into the long valley that holds Lake Willoughby like cupped hands, and she arrived in Ashford before the light was gone. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, the kind of afternoon Vermont saves for the end of the season, slant light through bare maples, the smell of cold moving in from the north, Malcolm was painting the new workshop window trim in the deep green that Isaiah had selected from the sample cards with complete authority. Reeve was on the porch steps with a lease proposal in her lap, something that had arrived Friday and that she had decided could wait until Sunday. Isaiah came out the front door at a run, socks on, granola bar already half finished, and stopped on the porch. He looked at his father by the workshop. He looked at Reeve on the steps. He had his father's way of observing a situation unhurried, without judgment, taking the full measure of things before drawing conclusions. "Is your friend staying for dinner?" he asked his father. Malcolm looked up from the trim. He looked at Reeve. She closed the folder, slowly, deliberately, the way you close something when you have decided it can wait. She didn't answer Isaiah. She looked at Malcolm, and for the first time in longer than she could easily say, she didn't calculate the next step before she took it.
How many lives get shaken before a single dad finally stops letting polished people talk their way into power? He lied through credentials and leveraged through contracts. He bent the record for profit and bent the truth for leverage. What would you have done when the forged amended and those Meridian emails finally brought the whole thing into the light? Subscribe for more stories like this and leave a like if you believe quiet strength still wins, because when the record is false, the receipts matter, and sometimes the paper trail is the only thing standing between your child and everything you built.